begin this masterclass today by acknowledging that we are located on traditional lands of Metchewan, Matagami, and Flying Post First Nations, which is home to many Ojibwe, Cree, Oji Cree, Algonquin, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that we are situated in Treaty 9 territory, which is also known as James Bay Treaty, which is steeped in the rich Indigenous culture of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for Transitioning Your Farm to Regenerative Organic Masterclass, which is the first session of our 2025 Agri-Business Knowledge Camp. Over the next few months, we're going to be hosting a series of different masterclasses and webinars, which will be designed to increase your knowledge as well as build capacity within your business to grow your operations. Agri-Business Knowledge Camp is a program led by the Timmins Economic Development in collaboration with BioEnterprise Canada and Link North. So before we start our masterclass today, I want to invite Brandon Kemp from BioEnterprise to say a few words about his organization.
Hey, thanks, Ross. You got me here? Looks like yes. As Ross said, I'm Braden. I manage BioEnterprise Canada's Grow Ontario Accelerator Hub. BioEnterprise is Canada's food and agri-tech engine, or as we call it, the engine for short. It's a national network of collaboration, commercialization, and thought leadership that empowers the innovation and growth and success opportunities for startups and scale-ups. And through the engine, we harness the skills, the experience, and the networks of leaders in the ag and innovation ecosystem from coast to coast into Canada's Agri-Tech Alliance. We also share the same network, through the same network, the resources, the knowledge, and the connectivity that the Canadian agri-food businesses need to scale and grow. I'm going to put a link in the chat for you here for the engine online, where it's an online platform. You can interact with BioEnterprise staff, advisors, mentors, as well as other innovative entrepreneurs in the space. So thanks, Ross, for giving us a minute here, and I hope everyone has a great session.
Thanks, Braden. So I'll speak a little bit about the organizations that I represent. So Timmins Economic Development, we focus on advancing community and economic development in Timmins and its region. Developing the agriculture sector is an important area for us. We support businesses by helping them with accessing funding and other resources to develop their agri-business. As well, we work with regional partners like BioEnterprise to create a thriving and sustainable agriculture sector. Link North is our innovation center. We provide business advisory services and boost funding up to $10,000 to support our agriculture and other entrepreneur clients with launching, scaling, and growing their business. Whether you're an entrepreneur looking to start a business or an established agriculture business looking to grow further, our organization can support you in a number of ways. I'll provide this contact information in the chat box. I want to now introduce Dorthea Gregoire from Canadian Organic Growers. Dorthea has passion for working on agriculture landscape and a strong interest in regenerative farming. Today, she's going to share her knowledge of regenerative organic farming, providing valuable knowledge to farmers interested in adopting those practices. Please welcome Dorthea.
Thank you, Ross. Very happy to be here, and thank you to your whole team in collaboration for the invitation. It's always great to get out and speak to a new group of farmers. And like Ross said, today I'll be talking about transitioning your farm to a regenerative organic, and specifically why soil health is really key to your success. And I'll be drawing on some of the experiences we've had with our Regenerative Organic Oats program, which is a prairie-based program. But before I jump into that, I'd like to start off with a bit about my why and why I'm really here. I'm based in southeastern Manitoba. Grew up originally on what was the first and, to the best of my knowledge, the only organic market garden operation out in the Red River Valley, surrounded by much bigger scale grain operations. Unfortunately, back in the mid-1990s, that area became a bit more difficult with all of the flooding. So we ended up moving ourselves out to a very different context out in the Sandy Lands, where, as you can imagine by the name, we went from those beautiful clays of the Red River to the sandy areas, swamp surrounded areas of sandy lands. And that really brought into perspective, the need to work with the environment surrounding us and just how much power the natural environment has over everything we do when we're trying to work in agriculture. As a teenager out surrounded by swamps and no neighbors for miles, I became really enthralled with all of the creatures out in the swamps. And I strongly will encourage anyone who ever has the opportunity to crawl out to a swamp, strange as it may seem, to just stop, sit down if you have the chance, and really look and see all the ridiculous, strange creatures, especially the insects and the arthropods that are living there under the water, in the bits of debris, and look at how different they are, how strange they are, how they behave, because that really, even at a young age, snagged me. And I guess for me, that led me into out to the East Coast, where I ended up following a bachelor's of science in biology and then ultimately getting my PhD in bugs. So I'm an entomologist. I love looking at how bugs and plants interact. But when it came down to making the bigger decisions in my life, what I was going to do with myself, what I was going to pursue, I found myself coming back to the prairies. And, through my career now, I've worked over a decade directly with farmers. And every time, whether it's, a stress from my job or a stress in my personal life or anything, I find myself always heading out to the land. So for me, we're in the tall grass prairies, and there's nothing better to boost my mood, to, help me think straight, than taking off my shoes and walking straight barefoot across the prairies. And for any of you who are growers or gardeners, you might have that same feeling, going out when you're feeling a little bit off and just digging your hands into that soil, right? And it's not just, some strange propensity that some of us have for getting our hands dirty or our feet dirty, but there's science behind it, right? Researchers have found now how there's these bacteria in the soil who, when they interact with our skin, they make our brains give off a bit more serotonin. So they're literally making us happier. And it's that interaction that really captures me, right? These tiny microbes out in our environment that can have such a huge and immediate effect on our individual moods, never mind all the other bacteria and microbes that are out there and can be doing amazing things for us. And that's plays a big part into why I'm here today and why I continue to work in agriculture and with farmers, because it's in the agricultural landscape that I see our single biggest opportunity to make things so that, my children and their children and my 7 times great-grandchildren can still have that opportunity to interact and to feel happiness just walking in the soil and digging in the soil and learning about it. And that's why I'm really excited to be here today talking to you about the power of the soil and all those creatures that live there and how we can actually use that to our own advantage by understanding it. So, before I get too far in, I'd like to introduce you to one of my favorite farms. This is the Schill Farm out just northeast of Regina in Saskatchewan. We were there for our field day looking at this gorgeous field of oats that's planted with, I think it's a 12 species cover crop mixed in with it. And this field of oats, to be honest, has gone through a lot that year. We were there the first week of August, and by that time, it had been 4 or 5 weeks since it had seen rain. That field also was a little bit an area of concern by the farmer because a few weeks ahead, not only had the field been dealing with an absence of rain, but this mixed farm had a sheep pasture immediately next door. And the sheep got out and literally mowed those oats down to the quick. Same with the cover crops. So there was really no big expectation for this field. I bring it up because when we were there, you can see on the other side of the screen a chicken tractor, and that chicken tractor was parked just outside of the limits of the field, and those chickens were having a heyday because there were grasshoppers everywhere in the pastures, in the laneways, and even in the chicken tractor where those chickens were just loving it. But as we walked through the oat field, we noticed that there weren't any grasshoppers. This is an organic farm, so no spray, nothing had been done to control the grasshoppers. But we asked the farm, what do we think's going on here? And it really boiled down to some of the power of the regenerative organic practices that he'd been implementing here. We took some of his oats, we crushed them up, and did what's known as a Brix test, which is basically a measure of the dissolved solids in the foliage of his crop. That includes the sugars. And for reference, anything with a Brix reading over 12 is considered good. His reading was up at 19, and that meant all right, I'm not sure where exactly I cut out, so I'm going to move forward and we can talk about the Shill farm a little bit later. Yeah, so a bit about Canadian organic growers. I work as the Director of Education, Extension, and Outreach for Canadian Organic Growers. We're a national educational charity, and we're actually Canada's oldest organic and regenerative association. This year is actually going to be our 50th year anniversary. So we've been on the landscape since 1975, with representation literally from Vancouver Island all across to Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. So staff coast to coast and in many places in between. Our goal is threefold. We envision a regenerative and resilient organic food and farming system across Canada, and we do this through collaboration and leadership with organizations like Today, advocacy, and that's a lot of work with government and policy, and then also education and research, and that's where the Regenerative Organic Oats program comes in. So Regenerative Organic Oats, what we're trying to do here is really support farmers who are looking to transition to regenerative organic management, specifically in a prairie context, so Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and with farmers who are interested in including oats in their crop rotation. One of the unique things about our program is that we're working up and down the supply chain. So we have partners invested from various brands as well as millers. So Nature's Path, Riverside, MGM, and Bay State are our founding partners. We're just coming out of a 3-year pilot program, 2025 being our first year of turning Roo into one of our core offerings here at COG. And like I said, we're really looking to support that transition. But by doing so, we're also increasing on-farm resilience to weather extremes. We're looking at improving soil health and fertility. We're improving carbon capture and retention in farm soils. And we're even addressing crop pests, disease, and weeds. And the way we do this is threefold. We know that farmers learn best from other farmers, so we support communities of practice across our network. We bring together farmers during social online networking groups. We have field days. We also have a focus on knowledge transfer, both between peers, so amongst farmers, and from subject matter experts to farmers, based on subjects that our participants have identified as being of interest. We tailor all of our training and what we do specifically to the needs of our growers. And this year, back in December, we actually launched a Regenerative Organic Hub online, completely open access, available to anyone, including all of you. And the goal of that was to address the need that we saw repeatedly being asked for by our participants for a single point source for information. Of all the things that our participants, our farmers have and are able to do, time is not something they have an excess of. And having to search through various websites, books, other resources for materials was a challenge, especially when looking for context-relevant materials. So our goal is both to create and to curate resources from across the web and bring it into one location where our participants and others interested in following that regenerative transition can find materials. We're also working towards what we're calling a Train the Trainer program. There's a big need and a lack of extension support out on the prairies for farmers who are looking to get into these kind of maybe less mainstream practices, though they're becoming more and more so. So we need to help support those people who could provide that advice and those supports to the farms. And we're doing so by creating specific materials for people who want to get into those farm support roles. And of course, as with any transition, before we know whether the changes we're making are happening at all or which direction they're going in, we have to know where we started. So we have developed an on-farm monitoring and benchmarking data framework and protocols. So every farm in our group receives an annual visit where we go out to the field with the farmers and we're collecting data. We're seeing where the soil's at, where the crops are at. We're looking at soil biology. We're looking at crop health. We're looking at the status of the landscape. So, are we dealing with ponding? Are we dealing with soil crusting? And we're also looking at kind of the basics of soil chemistry, the standards, stuff that many farmers are used to, and trying to establish where we are. And then more importantly, as the years carry on, determining what impact our regenerative efforts have had. That being said, it's really important to note that we aren't a prescriptive program, so we're never telling our farmers exactly what to do, but we are imparting them with the knowledge so they can make the best possible decisions for their on-farm management. Current participation, end of last year, we had 24 farms, and we've decided to bring in about 8 farms per year. This year, we have an additional farm auditing the program. Our farms range greatly from people working on a single quarter section. I think our smallest acreage, cultivated acreage, is about 50 acres, all the way up to farms running, 29 quarter sections. So that's almost, 4,500 acres. Our farmers, some of them are beginners, brand new to agriculture, to veteran growers who have been working for decades in farming and in organic farming, and some even in regenerative organic farming before the term was even coined. All of our crops are oat forward, but not all of our farmers grow oats every year. So we just see oats as a really important part of a good rotation for farmers transitioning to regenerative organic, and it's a staple in the area that we're working. Oops, pardon me. So what exactly are we trying to do? Well, what we've seen when it comes to soil health since we brought the plows to the prairies is a general degradation. So we're losing organic matter at astronomical rates, and we have been for decades. And everyone recognizes that right now we're having to put in more inputs to get the same production level out of the fields that we're working. This has led to a great movement towards sustainable agriculture, which kind of breaks that downward spiral and gives us a bit of breathing room. But we want to go beyond that. What we really want to do is get to the point where we're rebuilding or regenerating the soils and bringing them up through our careful stewardship to a level that might even exceed those that were here colonization. So before we brought the plow in, and see how we can work with our soil ecosystems to optimize our agricultural landscapes. But, if we're going to talk about soil health, we have to come back and remember that we can only be healthy if we're alive, right? And by definition, soil is very much so alive. We often think of it as the bits of sand, silt, and clay. So that's that brown section on the pie chart. But in reality, the sand, silt, and clay, the mineral components of soil, only make up about 45% of the soil overall. The rest, that other 55% of the soil, is made up of the living organisms and their byproducts. So whether that be the dead material from organic matter or the snot, slimes, and glues produced by these microorganisms in their day-to-day lives. That makes up the 5%, while the remainder, that 50%, is the air and water space, that pore space that are created by the soil microorganisms to house and feed themselves. So they can't live squashed between particles of clay. They need to make space, and they do that by gluing together the sand, silt, and clay to make room for themselves, to make room for water to move between soil particles, and to make room for air to be between these particles so that they can breathe and move through the soil system. And the soil, if we think about it as an ecosystem, it's very much so alive in that, if you were to go out to your fields and take a single teaspoon of soil, in very healthy soil, you can find up to 1 billion individual, organisms. And that would include anywhere from 10 to 50,000 unique species within that same teaspoon, which is astronomical. If we're talking 50,000 species, that's more than all the birds, reptiles, and mammals that we know of on this whole planet. So that many species in a single teaspoon. In the rhizosphere, so that's the area around the roots of a plant, the plants and the microbes interface, and that's where they're building communities. The plants are actively feeding the microbes in that area. So they're taking the sunlight, turning it into sugars and carbs, and actively exuding it through their roots to the microbes, where the microbes are bringing them nutrients to exchange with the plants. Like I mentioned, they're also building their homes in that highly desirable location, because why wouldn't you want to build your microbial home, your soil aggregates, right where you're being fed? And together that creates a very active living space being cultured by the microbes and the plants in the soil around our plant roots in our rhizospheres. And we have to remember that, soil is first and foremost biological. So keep that in mind as we go through this, because it's that microbial workforce that we really have the opportunity to employ as we move towards regenerative organic farming. So at the base of it all are a few natural ecological processes that function in all of our landscapes. We know about energy flow, the sunlight that turns through photosynthesis into sugars and is pumped into both the plants as food and then out into the soil. We know about the water cycle, nutrient and mineral cycles, and then the community dynamics that drive it all. But when it comes to implementing these into practice on our farms, people smarter than myself have come up with some amazing principles that we're able to use to guide our decision making in order to support that microbial workforce, those communities, and to really augment those ecological principles that I just showed to you, so that they work towards creating agronomic landscapes that can really support both us and the plants and the microbes. These, I hope, are somewhat familiar to you. The first, and I'd argue the most important, is knowing your contexts. There's also keeping living roots in the ground, armoring the soil, limiting disturbance, diversification, and then integrating livestock. So I'm just going to take a bit of a moment to talk about each of them and how they can really empower us, regardless of whether we're working in a small, 4-foot by 8-foot garden or working on a 10,000 acre farm. So when we think about context, we're often considering our soil type, our climate, frost-free days, photoperiod, how much rain we get. But I also challenge you to consider yourselves in your context. What is your access to capital and resources? What kind of machinery and tools do you have at your disposal? Consider your labor, your workforce, and often more importantly, consider a bit of a more holistic view, your work-life balance. How many hours do you want to spend in the field? How much of your time do you have? Are you in your 20s with a newborn baby that needs attention? Or are you at the end of your career looking to put minimal investment into your farms? Or maybe you're somewhere in between where the farm can be your priority. And most importantly, consider your goals for your future, as they can really determine how successful your approach to working in regenerating your soil can be. Interestingly, we talk about keeping a living root in the ground, keeping plants growing, and how important these microbial systems are. But plants actually have been found to put up to 60% of the sugars that they're producing through photosynthesis into the soil to feed the soil microorganisms. So if we're considering 60%, that's a majority of the resources they create, which tells me that the plants see the value in feeding those microbes. They know the value that those microbes can bring in bringing resources and nutrients directly into their rhizosphere, so to their roots. So even though talking about microbes might seem a bit alien and a few steps away, all we have to do is follow the lead of the plants and give them the opportunity to work with the microbes by keeping a living root in the ground as much as possible throughout the season, throughout the year, I challenge you, so that they can be feeding these soil microbes as much as possible. As added benefit, roots in the ground, stabilize the soil. They create that soil structure, and they also turn into a huge percentage of the organic matter that eventually becomes humus in the ground. So we're building on our soil just by keeping the plants in the ground. And most importantly, we're keeping our microbial workforce fed, because when there's no plants feeding them, so exuding through their roots, they have to turn to another source of food. And unfortunately, that can be the organic matter in our soils. And we don't want our microbial workforce siphoning off those resources. We want to keep them in place to build soil structure and to feed our crops. Armoring the soil. So again, thinking about our microbial workforce, if we have bare black soil, if you've ever run across hot sand in a sunny day, you know how hot it can become, hot enough to burn your feet, at least in my experience. And if you're a microbe trying to live in that community, you're going to be cooked. And that's the opposite of what we want to do. Beyond that, the force of rain, which we think is such a beautiful thing, right? A beautiful shower of rain coming down, cooling everything, giving maybe the microbes a break. But that single drop of rain can hit the soil at such high velocities that it's literally pounding it into oblivion, destroying that soil structure, those aggregates that the microbes have built up to be their homes and to be their sources of food. So in doing so, creating this impenetrable crust, which further exacerbates our problems, because then water just can't even soak into that crust. So we end up dealing with runoff and drainage issues and all those other undesirable aspects of water management in an agricultural context. And of course, as we all know, bare soil, very open to wind and water erosion, which I think is the greatest sin, because our topsoil is our greatest resource. And when we let it blow or wash away, we're losing all that hard work that we've put in, all the nutrients we've put in, all the organic matter that we've built. When we talk about disturbance, I like to talk about both physical and chemical disturbance, because they can be equally damaging to the soil, from the standpoint that what you're doing is breaking up the normal function of your soil food web, especially if you think in terms of all of the beautiful fungi that live in our soils. And as we know, fungi create these beautiful nets of hyphae that are like little tiny root filaments that will attach themselves to our plant roots and build out so that the plants can reach for more and more areas of the soil and accumulate more and different nutrients across that greater surface area. But when we run through with a tiller, or when we spray with an insecticide or a pesticide, or even, add some synthetic fertilizers, that can really break up these hyphae and break down the structure of our soil, not to say that they can't recover, but meaning if they're constantly needing to recover because of our management actions, then they're never at their optimum structure, right? And eventually some of our beautiful fungi that work so hard to bring these nutrients into our plants will end up dying out. So with disturbance, I think we have to always remember that although we will undoubtedly need disturbance to maintain our agricultural landscapes, we have to become very intentional about what we're doing and think about how frequent are we going to disturb the soil? What intensity are we going to do this? Are we doing a huge deep tillage, or are we just doing a very surface harrowing? Across what scale are we doing this? Is it the entire farm, the entire field? And again, when are we doing this? Talking about diversity, plants feed microbes. Different plants have different offerings to make to our microbial workforce, and different microbes do different jobs. So in very simple terms, the more diversity we can offer through our plants, the more likely we're able to cultivate a diverse community underground. The reason why this is super important is because diversity in the microbial workforce means built-in redundancy. And that means that in the case that we have to deal with a weather extreme or a tillage pass or a chemical spray or any other form of disturbance, when we have redundancy, meaning multiple different microbes with different tolerances to different disturbances available in our systems, that gives us a greater likelihood of being able to tolerate. So a bigger resilience, an ability to bounce back regardless of what's happening in our soils. And then livestock, one of my favorite. If you ever want to kickstart your system, bringing in livestock is one of the fastest ways to get things really moving. Just by nature that they're digesting, speeding up the nutrient cycling, and defecating back onto the ground, so that you're having a whole turn from plant material into what's hopefully usable nutrients for your microbes and plants in a really short period of time. Talking about all these principles, at the front of it, I'd like to start with a quote from Don Campbell. He's a rancher out in Saskatchewan, and he says, if you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. But if you want to make major changes, change the way you see things. What we're trying to instill in the Root program is that transitioning to regenerative organic is a journey and not a prescription or a destination. So ultimately, you're never done. You're going through this iterative process where you're doing, you're observing, and then you're assessing and you're redoing, and you're constantly changing and constantly getting closer to achieving whatever your goals may be. And hopefully that is a system that eventually is quite resilient. And to do this, we really need to take a systems approach, or in case of the microbes, an ecosystems approach. And like my participant from the Root program, Mark, said, you should never be satisfied with what you're doing. There's always opportunity for change and improvement. And we're seeing that with our farms. So here are some of what we've seen to date with our Root farmers. These icons you'll see are back to the principles that I mentioned earlier. And here's that shill farm. I don't know how much you heard when I cut out, and for that I apologize, but basically here, despite having an unexpected and unwanted grazing of his oats and cover crop mix, despite having no rain for the month previous, his oat crop wasn't being attacked by grasshoppers because of the way he's managing his soils. And so that the oat crop, when measured, had a Brix reading, so that's a reading of the soluble sugars in the plant material, of 19, far beyond the level, the reading of 12, which we assume is really good. And when we're talking about a Brix of 12 or above, we're talking about having such a high concentration of sugars and other dissolved solids in your plant material that grasshoppers literally can no longer digest that material and are leaving the crops alone. So good for the chickens, good for the crops, not so good for the grasshoppers. And that's what we want to see, you know, moving away from a need for pesticides towards crops that can actively fend off pests on their own. Here, again, we've been testing bricks, which can be done straight in the field with a small refractometer and a garlic press. This is a hemp field. We're seeing levels again above 20 out in Alberta, with just an amazing buzz of life in those hemp crops, but no serious insect damage. We've seen oat crops with bricks readings as high as 26 in some areas of Saskatchewan, which is mind-blowing, and which just shows how working on and focusing on soil health can really improve the health of your crop and its resistance to pests and diseases. Here's another situation, this one out of southeastern Alberta, where we had a farmer who had seen 7 seasons of losses to bindweed. So he had such a serious bindweed problem in this field that he just couldn't get a profitable crop out of it, regardless of what he seemed to be trying to grow. In talking to other farmers, he'd come across the idea of using buckwheat as a competitor to bindweed. So he mixed in some buckwheat along with a few other species. And he's actually able to get a decent buckwheat crop off of it because that buckwheat displaced the bindweed in the natural ecology of that field. It took the place, was a stronger competitor, and was a more desirable plant in the view of the farmer. Hope he's going to continue a bit more with the buckwheat, and hopefully he'll eventually be able to have this bindweed problem under control. In those same fields, he'd mixed in some alfalfa and used alfalfa leafcutter bees, so diversifying his operation to give him some different revenue streams. The alfalfa leafcutter bees became a revenue stream for him, and unexpectedly, he was able to, even after this first year of alfalfa, pull a small crop of alfalfa seed off of this field. So now you have the buckwheat, you have the leafcutter bees, and you have the alfalfa in a field that previously was seeing, you know, negative net returns for the last, well, 6 or 7 seasons. Here's another bit of innovation that has captured a lot of our farmers. We're talking about the use of compost teas and compost extracts to really inoculate soils with soil biology. If soil's been managed in a way that included a lot of tillage in the past, we can't automatically expect there to be sources for those microbes to come back to replenish our fields despite our new management. So we have to be active and provide them to our fields sometimes. And this doesn't always have to be expensive. This farmer in particular is very innovative and put this whole system together himself so that he can drag it behind his equipment as he makes passes, pre-existing passes on the field, and just giving it that bit of a boost. And this, in fact, led to those oat fields that we're talking about previously. I want to talk a bit about soil structure and potatoes. Potatoes seem a bit counterintuitive sometimes to those who want to go no-till, no disturbance, but it's never a lost cause. By use of diversity, by keeping soil armored, and by being realistic with our expectations. You know, you have to dig the potatoes out of the ground to get your crop. We're seeing farmers who are having phenomenal crops with little weed pressure in them because they're planting the plants that are taking the place of the weeds. They're creating diversity. They're creating strong soil structure that can withstand some of this disturbance. And they're creating habitat for the microbes that are feeding into their bumper crops of potatoes. Oh, it's just a bit more of the diversity there. One of the greatest places where I've seen the fastest uptake of regenerative practices is when we can plant out forage crops, multi-species cover crops that are then grazed by our livestock. That approach, I mean, not only are you getting amazing feed for your livestock, but it really allows you to start improving and increasing the nutrient cycling in the ground, which has seen huge increases in, depending on the context, of course, the growth of soil aggregates. So I have one farmer here in southeastern Manitoba who he always had a very wet field. Trouble getting tractors in, wouldn't dare drive on it after certain rains or in the spring. And within the first year after having he used full season covers in that field and then grazed them. He could feel the sponginess of the soil under his feet change. He could feel the change in that structure, and he could actually drive his tractor for the first time across those fields. So huge changes happening, even though we're not dealing directly with the microbes. We're dealing with the plants, but we are seeing the impacts that those microbes are having as they build up our soil structure. Again, focusing on diversity, a lot of interest in things like Johnson Sioux composting, creating that on-farm in totes to then be spread through compost teas and extracts onto the fields. There's an incorporation of worms. So even in cases where we have farmers who don't have access to their own livestock or to any nearby livestock, we're able to augment the diversity, use worms as our livestock. And in doing so, as Dr. Stark says, diversity allows us to produce more with fewer and fewer inputs. And ultimately, that's our goal, because none of us want to be spending our time or resources on inputs and their application if we don't need to. Livestock incorporation, again, this is a field with that has been seeded over, or a pasture, I should say, that's been seeded over with multi-species forage mix. And they're going out here and they're timing the grazing of their livestock so that these grasses, these forbs, these broadleaves are never getting to the flowering stage. They're never setting seed. So that means they're constantly pumping their resources below ground into their vegetative parts, into their roots, putting more and more exudates into the soil, feeding the soil microbes at an astronomical level, and really kickstarting their system so that they're seeing really rapid evolution of what was a struggling pasture previously, while simultaneously having a new place to graze their cattle. And all of this, can be seen at any scale, even in the scale of the garden. This bunch of grass has come out of my yard where you can see it's just got soil clinging to it because microbes have gone in there and glued together those soil aggregates to create clumps that cling to the roots, creating those little homes. And that's what we ultimately want to see. It's a byproduct of life, what we're creating in the soil. And we can see this with the earthworms that are living in our grounds in many places. We want to see those different clades of earthworms coming up and doing the different jobs, breaking through the soil. But I want to remind you that, sometimes when you look at your soil, it's not going to be perfect. This bit of soil isn't perfect. It's still a bit stodgy, if you will, but we're seeing the small worms in there. We're seeing the earthworm holes, and that's the first step. So we have to always keep in mind that we're not going to jump to, immediately to the end goal, but we will be seeing progress, and we have to celebrate each of those milestones. Here again, the soil's not perfect, but you can see how it's breaking down. So there's no longer those clay layers that we had seen previously, that I'd seen previously in this area. It's becoming incorporated. The worms are mixing the soils together. We're getting more aggregates, more stability. But overall, I think if I had one message to send, the real power of regenerative organic agriculture comes from groups like the one that's here today that can come together, share their experiences and their knowledge, and try things together so that we're not all repeating the same mistakes, and so that we can celebrate and amplify the successes that we find. So if you're just getting started, I tell you the first thing to do, even in this winter landscape, get out on your land and get a real sense for it. Walk it as often as you can, and take note of where you're at, and more importantly, where you want to be. My farmers who've been at this for the longest have said one of their greatest regrets is not having recorded their benchmarks earlier on. So not having recorded exactly where they are, how their soils were when they started. And then once you're out there, start acting like you're toddlers. And just ask why. Never assume we know. Just constantly ask why. Why is it happening? Why is it happening this way? Why did it not happen this way last year? And then get started on pick a principle. There's no wrong place to start, but start small. Don't bet the farm on it on day one, and really make sure you're working on your education and your understanding alongside of what you're doing in the field. And I think you'll find that those go hand in hand. And finally, don't be shy. Find a buddy, find a mentor, build your community so that you can grow together, and find what brings you joy when you work towards these regenerative practices and towards building your soil. As you could probably tell by my presentation, my joy comes from the microbes and the biology and really finding life out there in my plants. And that's been my focus. So find your focus and let us know, share how things go for you. Thank you guys all very much. I've put up here the Regenerative Organic Hub link. I'm always open to emails and calls, text messages from anyone who has any questions. But if you're interested in looking into more resources, just Google Regenerative Organic Hub and you'll find our hub and a whole slew of information. Thank you guys very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions anyone might have.
Thank you, Dorothea. Yeah, so as Dorothea mentioned, we'll open up the floor to questions. So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself or you can just drop it in the chat and I'll ask the question. Okay, so I guess it was a good, thorough presentation. I don't see any questions. So I want to thank everyone for participating in today's masterclass. So you can join us for our next masterclass, which will be Thursday, February 20th next week, same time, 10 a.m., as we welcome Bethany Deshpande, who is an innovation advisor with BioEnterprise, and she's going to discuss artificial intelligent technology applications in agriculture. So I've included that registration in the chat. We encourage you to follow us, Timmins Economic Development, on social media to stay up to date on upcoming programming. Actually, we got one quick question here. Asks, is there a certification for regenerative organic?
Yeah, so just to be clear, with our program, we don't require any certification for regenerative organic. We're looking at more of an application of principles, which can be done by anyone, organic, regenerative, conventional. But to answer your question, there is a regenerative organic certification available through the Regenerative Organic Alliance. In order to achieve that certification, you have to first be certified organic. And then there's a few certifying bodies, including EcoCert, that are offering that regenerative organic certification on top of your organic certification.
I see someone else typing. I want to see if it's a question or just a comment. Yes, so asking if we get the presentation. Yes, the session's been recorded, so we will share this with participants this week or next week. You'll get an email at the link to the presentation. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope to see you at our session next week, AI in Agriculture. Other than that, please thank Dorothea for taking time to do the presentation and share her knowledge. And it was a good wealth of knowledge, a lot of information shared. I'm sure it'll be helpful to our presenters, our participants. So thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, everybody.